Hi everyone, thanks for joining me today. I hope you're all well. I hope that you can hear me okay and see the presentation and see me. Sarah, if you could just confirm that someone else can hear me, that I'm not just speaking to myself, that would be great. But wonderful, fantastic. Good, thank you everyone very much. So I'm going to talk through today how Esmée Fairbairn uses data and our approach. I'm Esmée Fairbairn. I joined about just over 2 years ago into a role which was brand new. Esmée had before not really done a huge amount with data, but was keen to do more. Particularly the CEO, who was relatively new in post as well, Caroline Mason. And so I was brought on board to do. And my background's in a range of working for startups and some media companies as well, using data for strategic purposes, including financing, among other things. But this was my first foray into grant making, so it was an interesting experience. So while I go through kind of how we use data and what we're doing with it, I mean, essentially, we're still working out our approach to data and what we should be doing with it. We are trialing a few different things. We're taking a few different. We are working on a few different areas, which I'll go through with you. But if you see anything in here that you think is particularly interesting, or you think that we're missing something really obvious, then I'd really like to know just not what any questions you have about what, but also what we should be using data for. And we can try and get in, and we'll get into that towards the end. I'm hoping the presentation itself won't be too long and we can have a bit of a chat afterwards. And please use the Q&A function to ask any, or the chat to ask any questions. Great. So, essentially in brief, Esmée uses data in 3 key areas. First, unsurprisingly, is the assessment of grants. So this includes the due diligence information and the financial information about the charity, their income, their turnover, their financial projections, what they, how many trustees they have, how many staff, all of that, as well as the kind of qualitative stuff around what are you actually going to do with the money if we gave it to you. What are your plans? What are you going to achieve? And that's kind of that is really a large chunk of what we're collecting. We'll also collect some data, partly from the grantees, but also through the grant managers who are assessing them, collect some data regarding forecasts around future likelihood around funding. So I'll go into this a bit more, but one of the great issues that we have as a rolling fund, because we don't have, we're open all the time for applications, is making sure that we actually can hit our budget. And I mean, I say this, and it's weird where hitting your budget means spending the right amount, not making it, not underspending. But we have to make sure we spend within a certain amount every year. So we have to do so. So I've been doing some work around trying to work out around that, and we collect some data to try and help us assess whether we're going to be able to hit that number. And then finally, the last section we collect, the other set of data we collect is around learning. So this is everything to try and help us improve what we're doing and iterate and do what we're doing better. So there is, as all of you who know who have ever applied for a grant, which I have also done myself many a time, that there is a lot of questions being asked by each individual funder. A lot of it is very repetitive and extraordinarily tedious. But there is this constant tension between lowering the burden for applicants and making sure that they don't have to put in any unnecessary information, but while also ensuring that we have the right information to make a fair and accurate judgment on whether we're going to fund them or not. So that's underlying issue and tension. Takes a lot. Excuse me. Takes a lot of our thinking and our policy making around our application process. So in September last year, we unveiled a new strategy, and along with that, a new application process. And I won't go into this in too much, but in terms of how this is relevant. So applicants now submit initially a very short expression of interest, and by short I mean 100 words, with some basic information which is partly pulled from the Charity Commission and some basic eligibility criteria. Like, for example, some of which you can be automatically failed on. So if you're an independent, or if you're a Scouts hut looking for roof repairs, then that we don't, because we don't do capital projects, and you're out. Then you won't be able to get through. And then otherwise, assuming though you're eligible, then you'll then be assessed by team members to work out whether to progress you to the next stage. And then there is a phone call and some bits and pieces around that. After that, we then ask you to submit a full proposal where we ask more information about the actual project in terms of what you're going to do, but also more due diligence information around financial information, around your team, all sorts. So more of an in-depth look at you and your organization. So, I mean, essentially, there are three ways we use this. Unsurprisingly, funding decisions is how is the main part of it. We need to be able to make the right decision. We need to make the right decisions to be able to make our best effort to fulfill our strategy, as we have this five-year strategy which we're trying to hit. At the same time, we are then also trying to monitor our application system to make sure that it is equitable as far as possible, and more on that later. We're also looking at how long it takes us to make decisions, so we can try and make sure we have rapid responses and make sure there aren't any issues with people waiting around. And then finally, this issue about pipeline, about making sure that we are going to be spending the right amount in a year, or think that we are anyway. And then finally, just actual technical user feedback on the process, which is used simply to make sure that there aren't any bugs that we don't need to deal that we can't deal with, to see how otherwise people are finding the application process as a whole, see where they're finding it challenging, see where there may be any difficulties and things that we can improve and streamline going forward. So in terms of equity, in terms of equitable funding, this has been quite a move. This has changed quite a lot since I've been at Esmée. So before, when I joined, we essentially just asked a question about, or I think we may have even just allocated whether an organization was, quote, BME-led. And that was as broad as that sounds. We didn't really give a strong definition, and that was kind of it. But in 2019, the Funders for Racial Equality Alliance together to, and one of their streams of work was to audit foundations using a particular framework to work out how essentially how much their money were going to diverse-led organizations. So, and I've been involved in various aspects of that work in terms of designing it and the data collection of it, and the aggregation. And so we then move to a stage where which would fit into that framework. So using their criteria of whether, for example, one of their criteria is that for an organization to be BME-led, and again, this is language which I appreciate is a bit dated at this stage in 2021, that it must be 50% of the board and that particular demographic. Fully realizing on again, and we now are using we're now about to implement what is going to be the DEI data standard, which I've been working on for about a year, and they've been delivered by 360 Giving and the team. And this is a new way of us being able to assess a new framework for us to assess how equitable our funding is. And there's about 20 funders who are implementing it or looking at implementing it soon into their application system. So you should certainly see a bit more uniformity in the kind of DEI questions you're being asked as part of your app. But in terms of how Esmée uses it, we'll be using that to see how our portfolio and how our and trying to make sure, it's a key point, that our funding is equitable, and that if we are failing in that respect, then looking at what we can do to improve that. So this is a graph of the different stages of our assessment process, which is essentially the bane of my life, but it takes up at least a chunk of it anyway. And it's our trying to understanding of kind of how much volume of applications there are at different stages in the process. all the way from the beginning on the far left, which is called new box in there by accident, all the way to the end, which has declined. So you can kind of see how things are progressing throughout, and it means that we can kind of take a view. And so quite a lot of the data we collect feeds into this. In terms of trying to, as I say, work out whether making sure we need to spend the right amount within a particular threshold by the end of each financial year. So, in terms of learning, we collect. There are three kind of different ways that we're looking to collect learning data. One is through our annual progress reports, which everyone in our within that we're part. I the charity consultancy. Have been doing a lot of work around what's termed aligned reporting. So this is where we are trying to get we are allowing organizations to submit reports that they're using for other funders with more stringent requirements, or that they're producing for their boards, and that they can submit those instead of a fixed progress report. So this is kind of taking quite a broad, so it's quite a, these reports can be quite hard, it can sometimes be challenging. It's hard to get kind of structured data out of these reports because you're comparing so much different things out of so many different kinds of activity. But we want to be able to make this part of it easy and reduce the burden for applicants. And so this is why we kind of try to step away from you must report in a particular format, so then we can do something with it and you could tell us what you. Then along we also asked them to end a grant report, which is a bit longer. And then beyond that, and this has been particularly relevant over the last year or so, has been one-off days. So under the pandemic, for example, we did a top-up grant for our portfolio, which had no application process. We were just distributing a portion of funding to our organisations based on their previous grant size, and we, rather than asking for a report or an annual progress report, we designed a specific survey asking questions about what they did with the money and essentially how is it currently going under COVID. And so we use that as well to drive to collect further data around what's going on in our portfolio. And we use this in a few ways. We use it to identify trends in terms of what's happening. We use it to inform future strategy and to see what works and what doesn't. Importantly, we try to see how we can better support our grantees and how we are, and also broadly speaking, how we are doing in terms of achieving our strategy. But Esmée is very keen to we're not trying to kind of measure impact for impact's sake. We can learn to ensure that we are doing the right thing in terms of what we want to do in terms of strategic goals, and also then what we can do to help organizations to fulfill do what they need to do in order they can fulfill, so that they can fulfill their strategy and therefore ours. So that's a large part. So that's most of what we do regarding learning. So going forward, as ever, one has some ambitions. So the first thing is that some automatic keywording of grants using natural language processing. This will help us kind of categorize different sections of like quite chunky bits of text data, so we can see so it's easy to extract, and so you can write and better reports. Doing an analysis of our application process through a DEI lens. So this is kind of what I was referring to earlier, but with the DEI data standard, which is quite a lot more in depth than other things that we've been using previously, to kind of do a real breakdown of our application process over time to see where the issues are. And then finally, social investment. We are doing a little pilot at the moment, looking at the progress of how individual outcomes and then within that individual indicators are going, in order to understand how things are going for our grantees. So we're calling it as management indicators for the moment. So this is something like this. And so on the left here on the top table, you have our 3 of our impact goals in our natural world, which is our environmental area of work. And this is a count of the different outcomes. So we've got 2 which are on track for clean and healthy water, and then it says how many are on track at the end. And then the second table, we've split out each outcome by type. So it's about what they're destined to do. So if an outcome is about an organization, so for example, we're going to hire a new COO, that's an organizational outcome. Social is about social is about kind of what's happening elsewhere, about kind of your social impact in terms of more classic kind of definition of what charity does. And market is about the actual market for the area you're working in. So if you're an infrastructure organization, that's where it could be particularly relevant. Finally, is to see what is this a useful way of looking at the data? Is this going to be something that means that we can give something back? We can assess how we're doing and help our grantees and our investees do better in terms of what they're doing. So something we're just trialing at the moment. And then finally, in terms of how we support our grantees in terms of using data, there are kind of two sides to this, really, two avenues. One is that we support a small number of infrastructure organizations such as Data4GoodFest, who have obviously organized this today, and also Catalyst, which is the program from CAST. We support them to give support to grantees about how they use data and technology more generally, and then also then give individual support individual grantees with projects. This is both, which is wrapped into a large grant. We give, for data's sake, as it were, they must be, if there's a rationale why a particular data project will help us achieve part of our strategy, that's great. We'll certainly look at supporting that. And we will also then, I and my colleague Will Churchill will also, who's our tech lead, can also then give some further advice or support on what organizations have kind of data expertise that we think. That's it for me. So if you have any questions or any data, we'd very much like to hear you. I will now try and answer some of your questions and stop screen sharing. There we go. So I see there are 3 questions. So Charlotte Newman, for what data should be being measured? Do you look at whether the funding levels are meeting market need? So but essentially needs analysis is something that I'm really interested in. It is not something that we structurally go into in a lot of detail, because essentially we haven't come to an approach which we think works sufficiently across our portfolio for us to kind of implement it. But it's certainly something I'm interested in, and something that I'd be very, if people have models and frameworks for being able to assess market need, which is the big question mark for me and all these things, then I'd very much like to hear about it. Claire Bernard, my friend has built an NLP tool that automatically classifying grants. Thank you. I will have a look at that. Alistair Alexander, if you use natural language processing for submissions, how are you addressing the risk of algorithmic bias? So we won't be using, okay, so I should be clear of that. In our use of natural language processing, we would be using it to essentially tag bits of text with keywords, but not for an assessment basis. That would be for learning only. So the intention would be that then 6 months down the line, when we want to have a look at, I don't know, what funding applications we've had around clean water, we can then pull some analysis, look at saying, here are the top 30 keywords, here's the text around them, which shows the context, and then we can pull up a learning report saying this is what people are looking for in this particular area, rather than saying, oh, you haven't hit the right keywords, so we're not going to fund you. I hope that makes sense, Alistair, and clarify. So I think that there's less risk. I mean, there's still risk of algorithmic bias in terms of the text training set, but it's less of a risk. It's not less. It is not a risk from an assessment and grant making point of view. More one from a kind of technical, how useful are these keywords going to be. I also see there's some questions on the Q&A tab. So Megan Sherwood asks, how was the existing data culture in Esmée when you joined? Have you helped colleagues that might not be data confident to join the journey? Good question. I feel you'd have to ask some of my colleagues about how data confident they feel. The data culture was, I mean, they had transitioned to using Salesforce, and they were using a digital CRM, and there was a lot about what they were doing which wasn't bad practice at all. But they were collecting quite decent data. The main problem was around that they weren't really doing very much in terms of analysis. And that's kind of what I've been kind of a lot of what I've been helping with, as well as augmenting the data they have been collecting. And they were keen to help grantees with data projects where there was lack of expertise in-house. And I think there was a kind of, I would say, a curiosity or positiveness about using data, but also a timidness about not knowing what to do. There wasn't sufficient expertise in-house. They didn't want to do things wrong. So I mean, I hope that I've been helpful in moving us along in the right direction. I mean, I think that we are to the point where we can look at management indicators and look at the DEI data standard as a way of kind of assessing our application process, and indication that we are moving in that data confident more data confident direction as an organization. Maria asks, how do you share data across the organization? Is this mostly via visual dashboards? And if so, what do your colleagues want to see in dashboards? So this is almost so we do it in two ways. If people are trying to do an in-depth report on something, particularly around learning, then someone usually runs the report for them. Usually I try to get to them self-serve as far as possible, but sometimes that's not possible. And then, so if you're trying to do a learning report and need a bunch of text, then they'll usually get that text in kind of structured data form, row by row, and they can make use of it that way. Otherwise, in terms of the quantitative data, then yeah, we usually do that visually through dashboards. We use something called Looker, which is a bit like Tableau. In terms of what they want to see, that is a question that I ask myself every day. It's so tailored, and the answer, I think, is often simplicity and not overloading them with information. I think what's been interesting is making sure that people understand what they're looking at. That's been a kind of consistent challenge, because this stuff is quite complicated. And I want to make sure that they understand what they're looking at. But I must confess that I think I'm still very much on the journey to understanding what are my colleagues and the different segments in the organization want to see, because it really does vary. Alistair, we've already answered your question. I hope that gave a sensible response. Ali Hanbury, are Esmée also assessing itself in terms of own DEI credentials and representation? Yes, we are. We did our first internal survey last year. I would have to double check what the plans are in terms of publishing that, but that is intended to be a regular exercise to understand where we are in terms of credentials and representation. And we are very much aware of that being a concern. For me in particular. I think I've answered everyone's questions. If anyone, as I said, if anyone has any, Mary Maloney, there's a rapid fire coming in. Have you had a chance to your systems? You mentioned Salesforce. Have you had it adapted to allow for better analysis tagging? Have you had to adapt it? Yes. I mean, so when I joined, and what we're still really doing is that we can provide at different stages a list of keywords for our grant managers to use to tag essentially chunks of text, and that's been and that's essentially people use them inconsistently, which is a very human thing. Sometimes, and some of it is because the keywords are poorly labeled, and some of it are because they're ambiguous, and some people it's just because people have to interpret things differently. So we are keen. So hence the looking at trying to do natural language process tagging instead, rather than taking out the hands of individuals, so it's more consistent. And we'd be looking at doing that through a bespoke bit of Python NLP, which we'll use as an API, which we'll use as an API into Salesforce if anyone is interested. Kirsten, you mentioned that the data insight helps you delivering a strategic mission. Do you have any examples where evidence conflicted with your mission and priorities and strategy had to be changed? That's an interesting one. I think that one of the areas that, around this has been about about lack of applications in particular areas under our natural world environmental aim, where our evidence kind of showed in our applications we're not getting the applications through from both from diverse-led groups and also in particular specialist areas, and starting to work more on how we're going to encourage applications in areas where we're currently being underserved. Claire Bernard, that's probably the only example I think right now, but that is a good question. I should come up with more better examples as to how the tip of my tongue. Claire, how many people are there in the data team? There is currently me, and I'm having an analyst join me, well, meant to be last week, but there are some mild issues which I'm just sorting out in terms of visas, so there'll be 2 of us very soon. And then there is also a tech lead who assists, and also we now have a 2-person Salesforce administration team who deal with the kind of day-to-day issues in terms of running our CRM and some of the data. Kate asks, you mentioned supporting other organizations providing data and digital capability support provision to frontline charities. Are you still looking for other initiatives to fund? So we're always interested in people who have interesting ideas about how to support data and digital provision within the sector. So we have a pipeline. We have spent quite a chunk of our money on infrastructure. But I'm always interested in knowing if people have suggestions and ideas and projects. So please do let me know and get in touch if you have something that you want to discuss. I hope that I've now answered everyone's questions. Sorry if that went slightly out of sequence. I think I misread which way around it was going. I'm just checking the chat. I hope this has all been reasonably interesting. Thank you very, very much for joining. And I look forward to speaking to you all soon. And please do get in touch. I'm just going to put my email address in the chat. If anyone wants to get in touch, please do. Always happy to talk. Thank you, everyone.